believe it or not, and you probably don't at this point, we're touching the top of the iceberg. If I said that 5/6 was underwater, I'd be lying. It's a lot more than that. We're just touching a bunch of old high-level sorts of things here in all of this. Now, I told you that there are two types of concurrency control. There are actually more than two. But we've already talked about what's called pessimistic concurrency control, which is basically, I'm going to wait and make sure I can lock the things that I'm going for serializability. Let's say I'm going to be pessimistic. I'm going to make sure I hold the locks so that, assuming I can get all the locks that I need, by the time I get to the transaction, the locking is not going to get in my way. The transaction works. It's going to be okay. And again, there are looser consistency things you can play with, like snapshot isolation. By the way, remind me when I get to MVCC that I want to address a point about copying that you asked earlier. I will probably remember it myself, but a couple of slides down I'll be talking about MVCC, and I want to talk about copy on write and how that relates. But first, what I want to talk about is another approach other than pessimistic. If you can get all the locks you want, possibly by killing another transaction. Remember, these transactions can be bloodthirsty, and higher priority transactions, when you're playing the wait die thing, may end up killing other transactions so that they can proceed. The way of doing deadlock avoidance. There is another approach which is called optimistic concurrency control. And optimistic concurrency control can be thought of as, and there are variations of it, but it can be thought of as a more Pollyanna-like approach. Or if you've read Candide, Pangloss approach, we're in the best of all possible worlds. La, 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 la. Everything's going fine, everything's going fine. And then it comes time to commit the transaction. And that's when you check to see whether or not all your optimistic assumptions that everything will be fine are true. So rather than grabbing locks, and grabbing locks can cause you to wait, it can be expensive. La, 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 la. Everything's going cool until it comes time to decide whether you can commit the transaction. And then you do a validation check to see whether or not your rosy best of all possible worlds assumptions are true. And if they are, then you commit the transaction. And if they aren't, remember my joke about the Marx Brothers from the Night at the Opera? At one point they were imitating Russian aviators, and they are asked to give a speech. They have these big beards and so on, and Chico explains that they're aviators. The first time they wanted to come from Russia to New York, they flew, they ran out of gas halfway through, and they had to go back. Second time, they took more gas. They were about to land again, they ran out of gas, so they had to go back. Third time, they took the boat. With optimistic concurrency control, you can do all this wonderful work, not bothering to waste time grabbing locks. Except that you could get about to land in New York and run out of gas and discover that your rosy assumptions didn't work, in which case you're gonna have to try the transaction again. So I'll start off with a bit of the punchline. Which is better, optimistic or pessimistic? It depends. It depends. The advantage of pessimistic is that you never have to run out of gas and go back. Once you have your locks, everything's okay. The disadvantage of pessimistic is you might have to wait a long time for your locks or kill other transactions or all the rest of it. Whereas with optimistic, you don't have to wait around for locks, but you might do almost all your work and then discover you gotta go back to Russia and maybe take the boat. Try it again. So the general idea is locking is a conservative approach. You prevent conflicts by grabbing the locks. Of course, you may have to wait for the locks or kill somebody to be able to get them. There's a lock management overhead. There's having to deal with deadlock detection and resolution. There can be bottlenecks when you have heavily used objects, even if you put them late in the transaction. A good thing to do when you have a bottleneck is to put the access to that, particularly if you're writing to it toward the end of the transaction, because if you put it toward the end of the transaction, the probability that you're going to be holding it a long time is less. If you put it as the last thing you grab in the transaction, then you're going to be releasing it as soon as your transaction commits, so there won't be as much contention for it. But in situations, and they exist, I mean, how many people are contending for the same airline seat? It happens. It's not that often. But there's situations where there's not much contention. How many people are trying to update my bank account at the same time? Not that many. So in situations where there is low contention, and remember, there can be read-write conflicts, write-read conflicts, and write-write conflicts if you're going with serializability. If it's low contention, optimistic can be something where you go, la 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 la, the world is wonderful, best of all possible worlds, la la la. And then you check it before you commit. And most of the time you'll be right. That's kind of like the difference between the original, the optimistic kind of approach, that most of the time the leaf is going to be okay. It is not, that's not optimistic concurrency protocol. That's another example of an optimistic protocol. The optimistic assumption that there won't be any problem with the leaf, that the leaf's a good kid, that was an optimistic assumption. Optimistic concurrency control means something different, but it's also optimistic, meaning it's assuming that there won't be trouble that gets made. And so why bother going through the overhead of preventing trouble? Most of the time there won't be trouble. So this is the way that the basic Kung-Robinson, there are lots of variations. But the basic thing works. Again, there are going to be 3 stages. Lots of things have 3 stages. Some things have 2 phases, lots of things have 3 stages. This is a 3-stage thing. There's a read stage, there's a validate stage, and there's a write stage. And what's the idea? During the read, everything that you read, you just read. And what you do is you keep track of what it is that you read. Okay? But this is a kind of copy on write. When you change something, you maintain a private copy of what your change is. Copy on write basically says, I'm leaving things alone to be read by other people, but I'm going to copy my rights into a separate space. I'll keep track of what my rights are, I'll keep track of the new values that correspond to the rights, but I won't make them visible. Now there's going to be a stage which is called validate. I'm going to tell you a lot about validate. That's the most interesting part of this. La 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 la, the world is wonderful. Panglossian, best of all possible worlds. Let's see whether or not I was right. That's what validate does. Is what I read still there? Is what I read and what I wrote still okay because nobody else has written it? Read is not a conflict. Read write is a conflict. Write is a conflict. So is there a problem with somebody having written in a committed transaction stuff that I read? Is there a problem with somebody else writing something that I was trying to write? And then basically you need effectively to check for write conflicts, read conflicts, and write conflicts, and all of this gets done. And then if the validation worked, your private rights get committed to the database, including, by the way, changes to indexes, if need be. The index changes can take place at commit time too. You may not have to, by the way, you don't have to track subtlety. You don't have to make the changes to the indexes until you actually do the commit. There are various ways that gets approached. But you can make the changes to the index at commit. Now, you get the general idea. Now there's a subtlety that I'm expecting somebody to ask me a question about. Go for it.
Wouldn't you need to put locks during the validation stage to make sure that's not changing?
Not just the validation stage, but also the commit stage, the write stage.
Yeah.
I'm totally optimistic until I come to the last 2 stages. The last 2 stages where I'm not doing any work other than checking and then doing the rights, checking that everything can happen and actually committing it. That is a relatively short pessimistic transaction. So emphasis on this. I can go la 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 la. I do all this complicated mathematical work and all this stuff going on, but the part where I validate and I make the changes, I better make sure that that's atomic. That has to effectively be a relatively short. There's no programming complexity. It's just dealing with the read conflicts and write conflicts, and read write conflicts, write read conflicts, write conflicts. That's what's being dealt with. And then if everything's cool, I will do my commit. Other people can be figuring this out as well. But I will be grabbing locks on things to make sure that there isn't any trouble. Yes?
So what if the validation fails and it turns out that there is a read-write conflict and what you did was completely, like, you have to blow it up and start over?
It's a fantasy. Nobody else ever saw it, and I gotta start from the beginning. A very good place to start.
What happens if that happens like a lot of the time and then it just keeps on, looks like you're pushing back and back and back and
We're talking about one of the big disadvantages of optimistic concurrency control. Yes, I mean, what you could do is do some kind of exponential back off for all the rest of it, but if you have a design in which that's gonna be happening a lot and you keep having conflicting things and people have to back off, you've got a system that stinks. You also have a problem if you have pessimistic concurrency control and you have a lock on something that's a hotspot where you lock it early and everybody keeps having to wait for it and things stink. When we're talking about implementation, it's not this wonderful world of the database system takes care of it for you. You have to look at aspects of the design that affect performance. And you're absolutely right. That can and does happen. Maybe what you should be doing is splitting up things so you don't have as many lock conflicts, even if it means that you might have to read more to be able to do stuff in the rare cases where I have to look at all the branch values to look at it. But instead of having a total for the bank, I have a total for each branch, or instead of having for each branch, I have it for each teller. So there are ways of trying to deal with it that means more work, but less conflict and less blowing up of either the optimistic or the pessimistic. Database design is a pain, like optimization, which means that doing it right is really important and difficult and can be remunerative, but the rules for it are amusing. Question?
So in real applications, is there just a setting in the settings file that you use optimistic or pessimistic concurrency control?
Well, to start with, it can be difficult to mix optimistic and pessimistic together. So generally, systems typically work with one or the other. There's been work about trying to look at trying to mix them together, and it's not completely impossible because remember, there is a short pessimistic thing that you end up doing at the end, although they don't necessarily always work well together, but there is some possible way of doing it. But generally, in systems, you're either probably all optimistic or all pessimistic. There usually are not settings where a transaction or an application can choose which one it's doing. Not in most systems. There has been work on doing that. Not sure it's ever deployed successfully. There has been some interesting research. Detailed since you asked. So now I'm going to go into validation, and some of the stuff you need to know, and some of the stuff I'm going to tell you about. I'll tell you about the ideas. You don't need to know the details from the final. But the concepts you really do have to understand. The concept of validation is, I've been assuming everything is cool and there are no read or write conflicts. I will guarantee in validation that that's true. I will be doing that with an atomicity. I'll be doing the commit if it's true. Again, it's part of what effectively is a short pessimistic transaction. So you're going to check that the conditions on a transaction TG are sufficient to assure that it's not going to have any conflict past or future. It doesn't have any conflict with anything in the past. And by the way, later transactions will ensure that they don't have any problem with TJ in the future. So basically, what we're going to do is give every transaction a numeric transaction ID, which is going to be increasing, which is a logical timestamp, which we'll call TS of TJ. Now, something that people always get confused by on that. We're not assuming the transactions commit according to this timestamp. I could have a transaction that gets timestamp 17, which is short, a transaction that gets timestamp 18, which is long, transactions that get timestamps 19 to 25 that are short. 17 could finish first. 18 takes a long time. 19 and 25 might finish before 18. Just because it gets a timestamp doesn't mean it finishes first, a lower timestamp. It's just a number, okay? And the timestamp that gets assigned to a transaction isn't when the transaction gets started. It actually is assigned right before you start validation. So it might actually be the case that things happen in the timestamp order, but not necessarily, depending on how you deal with the atomic stuff you're doing. Now, two notations. The read set of a transaction is everything that it reads. write set of a transaction is everything that it writes. This is one of the negatives about optimistic. You are tracking the read set and the write set as you go. You're not locking, but you are tracking. Okay? Now, here's the way things end up working. TJ commit, if for all the transactions that are before TJ, and actually, I guess I will correct myself. The assumption is that these are being committed in timestamp order. Sorry about that. So the assumption is that the timestamp order is the order in which they're committed. Or some of them might not commit. So again, I want to correct myself. The assumption is that the timestamp says, first I'm going to try committing transaction 17, that may work. Then I'm going to try committing transaction 18. Then I'm going to try committing transaction 19, etc. Some of those will work, some of them won't, but I'm going to try them in the order. So in this approach, we're actually trying to do them one by one by one. In practice, there might be other variations of it, but I don't want to give you the other variations. So correcting what I said before, the timestamps do tell you the order in which you're trying to validate and commit them. So basically, TJ can commit if for all the transactions that are before it, okay, either one of three things. This gets complicated. I'm going to say a little more about it on the next slides. It'll become a little more intuitive on the next slide. Either the earlier transaction committed its rights before TJ starts. No problem. It basically finished before TJ started. Or the next thing, the earlier transaction TI completed its reads before TJ started doing its writes, and the tuples that TI modified aren't read by TJ. It's basically saying TI could have modified stuff, but TJ didn't read it. So that's going to be okay. And the most complicated of them all, TI completes its reads before TJ completed its reads, and the tuples that TI writes are not read or written by TJ. That also is going to ensure that there aren't any read-write conflicts or write-write conflicts. In particular, there aren't any write-read conflicts as well as write-write conflicts. So, okay. The idea is that transactions before TJ don't conflict with it. And again, the details are not going to be required. The concepts on this slide are things you need to understand. But I'm just going to show you pictures which are going to make this easier. The details are not going to be required. Basically, if TI completes the earlier transaction with the earlier timestamp, if it completed before TJ starts, hoo-ha, these don't interfere with each other, no problem. Next one. TI completes before TJ began its write phase. And the things that TI writes aren't read by TJ. And we're assuming that anything that TJ writes, it also reads. And what that says is TI never overwrites TJ's writes because basically TI completes before TJ began the write phase. So there aren't going to be any problems with that. Does TJ read any of TI's dirty data? No. So basically, there's not going to be any problem because TJ is not going to read anything that's dirty because what TI wrote, even if TI rolled back, TJ never read it. Okay, so basically, it's going to be something where TI completed before TJ began doing any writes. So it's going to know TI either happened or it didn't happen. But if there's not going to be any write-write conflicts, there's not going to be any read-write conflicts. So TJ is not going to read any of TI's dirty data. That's the general idea. And again, I could spend 15 minutes on each slide explaining it in detail. The bottom line is no write-write conflicts, no write-read conflicts. Okay, number 3. One of 3 different things going on. Either 3 things have to be true for this one. TI completed its read before TJ did. The earlier transaction completed it. And the things that TI writes don't intersect the read set of TJ, and the things that TI writes don't intersect the write set of TJ. So basically that says TJ doesn't read any of TI's dirty data, it doesn't overwrite any of TJ's writes, and so we're going to end up being okay. Again, there are not going to be any write-write conflicts or write-read conflicts. Basically that says it's all of these things say it's okay for TI to be before TJ because they're not going to, what TI is doing is not going to mess up what TJ is doing. Okay? So basically, it's not gonna be a problem, even if TI doesn't commit. TI might not commit, but TJ doesn't care. Because it's not messing with any of TI's data, with any of the stuff that TI changes. Could TI read something that TJ reads? Yeah, but not a problem. That stuff hasn't changed if it's just in the read set and not in the write set. So there's not a write-write conflict, there's not a read-write conflict with what went before. Now, a question that people sometimes ask about this is, this deals with the possibility that TJ didn't conflict with anything that went earlier. What about the possibility that TJ conflicts with something later? If TK gets a larger timestamp than TJ, it could be that K conflicts with J. But you know why that's not a problem? K is going to get validated after J. The timestamp order corresponds to the validation order. And you know what? K is only going to be allowed to commit. It's only going to have validation succeed if it doesn't have any problem with J. So J checks for problems with the earlier stuff. It doesn't check with problems with the later stuff because the later stuff, the later transaction, K, is going to check for a problem with TJ. J will roll back if there's a problem with something earlier. It won't roll back if there's a problem with something later, but the later transaction K will roll back if it's got a problem with J. So the order decides how you end up checking. If you're okay with everybody earlier, you can commit. You validate atomically, you commit as part of that same atomic pessimistic transaction. And if everything is cool, you don't have any problem with anything earlier, you commit, and the later transaction will not be able to commit if it ends up having a problem with you. Question?
So just to check my understanding, this doesn't have the issue of the phantom problem because it creates a copy of the data before?
The phantom problem is a totally different issue. The phantom problem has to do with whether or not you end up having locking on things that aren't there as well as things that are there. If you care about serializability, you'll have to have locks on the data, and you will have to deal with questions about inside your read set. There may have to be something where you end up having a read block on something that exists inside the index, and that may have to be part of the read set. That what you're doing is you're reading an index page, which is there, not just a tuple. But that's a great question to ask. So, okay, so you got the general idea of what's going on here. Okay, so the overhead on doing optimistic, you have to keep track of read sets and write sets, and you have to check for conflicts, which can be messy because there can be a lot of previous transactions. There are ways of being clever about how you end up checking that. Right, and so you have to do a critical section for validation, which reduces concurrency for validation and actually doing it, and it will restart the transactions that fail. So work done so far has to be cleaned up, throw away the extra cache copies and all the rest of it to be able to make that work. And I still have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to come close to finishing this lecture. There is something called MVCC. I told you I would say a little bit about it. I will probably have to say more about it at the beginning of next lecture before I go to lecture 15, which tells you about transactions and locks in great detail. MVCC basically has the idea of, and it's particularly useful when you're dealing with snapshot isolation, but it can be dealt with other isolation levels too. It's the idea that every time I read data, I'll do a copy on write. See, I had the debt to you on this. I basically indicate I'm reading something. I don't copy it immediately. I mean, I could, but I don't. What I do is I mark it as something where if somebody else writes it, keep my copy around. I want my copy to be kept around. I want to have repeatable read. And so I have a copy of the data. If the data doesn't change, fine, lots of people are reading it. No need to bother making copies, just to make a copy. But basically what will happen is if data is being read by a running transaction and somebody modifies it, they'll get a copy of the data that they have the modification on, which may or may not commit. But in the meantime, I have the data that I'm reading. And remember, with snapshot isolation, there's no conflict between my reading data that somebody writes. I read all the data as of when I begin. I see all of my own changes. I don't see other people's. There are write conflicts with snapshot isolation. There are no read-write conflicts with snapshot isolation. So basically, the idea with MVCC is that there are old versions which are useful for other things that are going on. I keep track of current data. I keep track of other versions. There are a lot of different implementations of MVCC. There even are some versions, by the way, in which I do make a copy every time something gets written, but deep details. But bottom line is, in fact, there are always copies when things gets written, whether they commit or not. But again, the old version of the data is possible. Reader is allowed to proceed, but if I'm trying to go for serializability rather than snapshot isolation, I have to know whether or not the writer committed. If I'm executing after the writer, then there are issues whether or not the writer occurred. If I write an old value and this other guy commits before me, then I can't commit after it. I'll have the ACR problem. Basically, I need to know whether or not I'm using the value that he wrote or not. So there are complexities. Bottom line is, if I read an old value and there's a writer, if that writer rolled back, no problem. I read the old value was there, the writer tried to change it, he didn't succeed. Okay? On the other hand, if the writer did succeed and he committed before me and I read an old value and I want serializability, I can't commit because I read a value that wasn't the current value as of the time I committed. So there are lots of things that are involved in doing this and lots of variations of it depending on what isolation level you're playing with. So all that is there. So we have all these different levels that exist with transaction support. And again, I'm not going to try going through this. I will just quickly go over this. I already mentioned it. There are things with MVCC where MVCC and snapshot isolation can work together well as lower levels than serializability. But we will quickly go over that and then start on talking about transactions logs next time. Sorry, I just need another 2 minutes and I don't have it. So you can come out of class and tell everybody that you learned to be optimistic today. To be continued.